everybody to this episode of Conversations with Iris. Today, we are joined by two experts in the field of Indigenous migration in the Americas. We have with us Valentina Glockner, who is a professor in Center of Research and Advanced Studies, and that's based in Mexico. We're also joined by our colleague Walter Flores, who is a doctor at the Center of Studies for Equality and Governance in Guatemala. So thank you so much for joining us from across the pond for this conversation about Indigenous migration. So I want to begin with a general question around what do we mean when we talk about Indigenous populations, especially in the context of Mexico and Guatemala. Valentina, I don't know if you wanted to say something about the Mexican context to kick us off.
Yes, thanks Jenny for the invite. It's a pleasure. Well, first of all, I would like to say that when we speak and think about indigenous populations, one of the most important things to keep in mind is that we are talking about the living memory and the living testimony that other worldviews and other worlds are possible and are being kept alive. For me, it's the testimony that there are life spaces and life possibilities beyond capitalism, beyond imperialistic ways of reproducing social, economic, and political life, and that there are other possibilities to think about the future and about future generations and their place in the world. So, and this is, I'm not trying to romanticize or trying to essentialize what indigenous and contemporary native people mean and contribute to the world. But it is very important to keep in mind that by endangering and dispossessing native people and native and ancestral knowledge, what we are doing is impoverishing the present world and impoverishing the legacy that humanity needs to, will bring to the future generations. Thanks.
Thanks, Valentina. Walter.
Yeah, so we talk about specific social groups. They have a unique identity, and as part of that identity is the central connection to land, territory, and the natural habitat, and they have also a very ancestral knowledge, and also connection as a social groups.
And in Guatemala and Mexico, both countries have quite significant indigenous populations. Is that correct?
So great. Guatemala is 45% of the total population.
Mexico is around 10–14% of the population. And what is very important to keep in mind is that this is a category, an identity that is self-prescribed.
And so, I mean, obviously, you know, we know that there is significant migration from Guatemala and Mexico. We're reading a lot in the newspapers about migration north up to the United States and Canada. And I'm wondering what's specific about indigenous migration within that overall context of people on the move in the region.
Right now, we can talk of very specific and worrying dynamics that are at the same time that are not new. It's important to say that indigenous migration is a very broad and complex phenomena. It's not unilateral as well. We can talk about forced displacement from ancestral territories because of transnational extractivist companies. And there's also a maybe more slow motion and less visible also forced displacement forced by economic inequality and structural violence, forcing people to leave their native territories, to leave their native or their livelihoods, to be able to produce, to migrate and produce, working in harvests, in industrial harvesting zones in Mexico, like wage laborers. And this has been happening for many decades since Green Revolution. And this is not only inflicting like a lot of pressure and suffering in families who have to abandon their families, their native territories, and this also interrupts the normal cycle of campesino or agricultural production, the reproduction of social, religious, spiritual, and political life. So basically, we have this economic displacement that goes more slowly, and that is driven by economic exploitation. And we have forced displacement caused by drug cartels and extractivist mining and dam projects.
Thanks, Valentina. That's super comprehensive. And Walter, what about the situation in Guatemala?
Yes, what I would add, because I agree with everything that Valentina said, I would only add that what is specific about the migration indigenous population is that it is a survival strategy for them. It's not like in many cases of migrants a way to improving economic well-being, but it's survival. And you can almost readily easy identify a structural oppression as part of the causes of the migration. So a structural and a long-standing oppressions that is related to that migration. So that's this unique groups with unique identity that share a common history of a structural and long-standing oppression in which migration is a strategy for survival.
Absolutely. And I know we've talked before, Walter, about the impact of climate change on some of these indigenous migration strategies. I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yes, climate change is becoming the most recent effect that is imposing on all the structural oppressions that have been occurring into migrant population. And it is also affecting mostly indigenous territories. And prior to climate change, the living conditions of many indigenous population were already very vulnerable because of the long-standing exclusion and oppression. So climate change just made things a lot more difficult. I mean, it's very different to face the effects of climate change if you are in a more or less improved living conditions than if climate change is affecting you when you're already living in a very poor, in a very vulnerable living conditions. So this is just adding to everything that has been affecting for centuries indigenous populations.
And is there similar kind of dynamics in these communities around, often it might be a kind of younger male in the family who's the first person to migrate, or, is it more of a kind of, is there a gender dimension that we see, or, are we talking about a family migration? Obviously, these are generalizations, but I'm just wondering about if there are any specific trends.
In the Mexican case, you can talk about very different and many trends happening at the same time. Forced displacement has hit rural and indigenous communities harder because they are not very welcome because of their language, their livelihood, and maybe even religious beliefs. It's not easy for them. It's not easy, in any circumstance, but it's has become even more complex when whole communities are displaced, to find the strategies to cope and survive with this forced displacement because of these reasons and particularities. And also government strategies to try to respond, even which are very scarce, often lack the knowledge of these specificities, religious, linguistic, cultural specificities. And within that phenomena, both forced displacement because of violence and forced displacement because of climate change are often impacting women and children even more. Women, in some part because of their traditional involvement in domestic labor, in keeping household and reproducing life within the community and the household, they often have to carry the burden of water scarcity, land theft, land dispossession, and the way that climate change is affecting harvests and campesino labor and livelihoods.
Are there kind of specific trends in terms of internal migration versus international migration?
Yes, at least in the case of Guatemala, the international migration, the most relevant period was during the peak of the war, the internal civil war, in which indigenous population were very much repressed in the 80s. So that was the peak of international migration. But after the peace accord, we could see that that was reduced. And now at this time, we are seeing an increase very similar to what happened in the 80s. But what's very important also to note is that although all the indigenous population face vulnerabilities, but the extent of that vulnerability, it does differ among indigenous populations. Some of them have extreme vulnerabilities, such as the example that Valentina was giving, or due to violence, or due to forced displacement because of extractive industries. That's this extreme vulnerability, or climate change, that's extreme vulnerability because families did not even have a chance to plan a strategy for moving. That's when everybody had to go, all the families, they lost everything, which is very different when you're facing vulnerability, but you still may have some time and resources to plan whether the father is going to go first, whether it's the oldest son or daughter, who's going first. So the possibilities of planning a strategy for survival is very different in that way. And what we are seeing is that families, they have all different situations. Some families that, although it's high vulnerability, not extreme as the other families that are facing a displacement, either into the country, so displacement that have been forced them even to flee internationally.
And is there a suitable response to the specific vulnerabilities of indigenous migrants, do you think? I mean, we've seen in the last decade that, for example, the UN system has really done a lot of work on protecting indigenous rights, and we've had a simultaneous kind of boom in with the Global Compact on refugees and the Global Compact on migration. And I'm wondering if, in your experience, these two different international rights agendas are speaking to each other effectively.
The limitation that I see is that the indigenous rights and protections only apply when they are in the territories. But this doesn't really apply when indigenous are on the move, indigenous families are on the move. So that's the most important gap that I can recognize, that when indigenous families are forced to leave their territories, there is the justification by state authorities, yeah, but they are not in the territories. So they just decided to choose to leave the territory. Well, they didn't decide to choose, they were forced to leave the territories. So in my view, there is a huge gap at the moment that the current protection that we have only work partially because in many states choose to ignore those protections, but partially works when they are in their territories. So that's what I think, that's a major gap, that we need to develop new protections and new mechanisms, especially when indigenous people have been forced to leave their territory. It has not been the choice, the decision. So we can ensure that if we decided that they needed the protection that we have at the moment, then that should continue if they are forced to move.
So the rights are kind of land bound or territorially bound at the moment, if you like. Okay.
And sometimes not even that. I mean, I totally agree with what Walter is saying, but that structural inequalities is deepened when you look at national constitutions. For example, Mexico has not even recognized indigenous people and native nations. We aren't recognizing them, and we are recognizing Mexico only as a multicultural country, right? So they are not given enough guarantees and constitutional rights to be able to exert and claim for those rights and for that recognition. So they are still kept in a second place within within the nation state, and that is something that will always prevent them from exercising full rights.
On the 11th of October, we have kind of Indigenous Peoples Day in the United States. You know, this has become kind of reframed, if you like, in recent years to kind of talk about especially Indigenous populations in the United States. And I'm wondering whether, because I know that both of you also, you know, have worked and have collaborations with colleagues in the United States. I'm wondering whether you see, you know, space for a discussion of how the host state, the United States, can protect the specific rights of Indigenous people on the move who arrive in the United States. Because we see in the media often it's kind of like this homogenous mass, and there are particular groups that are maybe made hyper visible, like young men, young Mexican men, or women and children. But I'm wondering whether in this discussion of migration to the United States, Indigenous populations are being spoken about and having their particular needs met.
There's a need of a broader and deeper conversation about this. I don't think their needs and their particular stories and cultural and ancestral and linguistic necessities are being met at all. I mean, we can barely say that for the rest of migrant populations or displaced populations, right? So I think we need a better understanding of what indigenous migration implies, what are their causes and long-term consequences, and we need specific policies recognizing that nation states have complex biases and structural inequalities that need to be addressed before thinking on transnational, or at the same time of thinking into transnational policy and transnational solutions, right?
Yeah, what I see is that in general, it's portrayed like migrants are more or less all of them the same, and they're seeking the same purpose, or they are arriving into the border because of the same reasons. And that, of course, that's not the case. So I think a lot of work that needs to be done is for the general public, but also authorities, to understand that there is a huge diversity of factors, or the people that are migrating or are on the move, and the history of oppression faced by some of them is a lot longer, and some of them may that be probably the only or the final strategy for survival that they may have. So I think we need to do a lot more and better work in not to place all the migrants in the same box. Is that our understanding of the challenges of migrant populations on the move in general, it would be much better if we were to understand the histories and trajectories and structural oppressions that they have endured.
Absolutely. Thanks, Walter. And I mean, even practical things, obviously this huge knowledge deficit is one factor, but also just practical things in terms of language, right? So interpreting in reception centers, for example, whether that's available in Indigenous languages, or, sensitivity, if you said, Valentina, to, certain religious practices or these kind of things. I mean, I think we're quite far from those kind of provisions being recognized, aren't we, in a lot of the facilities where we're working.
Yes, even indigenous medicine. I mean, sickness and health is not understood the same way that we, or in urban contexts or white populations understand health and sickness, right? So even being able to understand what are the traditional answers and responses and traditional medicine to common sicknesses and to illnesses that we don't even recognize, right? That don't even that Western medicine doesn't even recognize as valid or as if they don't exist, right? So even that, it's a huge challenge. I was a couple of years ago, I was at a shelter in the border, in the Arizona border, and there were a couple of doctors struggling to understand the way that Quiche migrants conceived the body and conceived the sicknesses and the ailments that were making them sick and make them, and it was not just the parts or the organs of the body who were hurting or who were ill, but also there was a huge role played by the nostalgia and the sadness of having left behind the family, the territory. And those things may seem anecdotal to some, but they are, in truth, they are totally central to the way that the world is being lived, experimented, and the way that indigenous people, families, and cultures are present in the world and negotiate daily challenges in the world and in the daily life, but even more so in dramatic happenings such as forced displacement or transnational migration.
Well, I'm hoping that, with the release of this conversation, we can make sure that Indigenous migrants can be included in discussions this 11th of October around Indigenous Peoples Day. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time. I know how busy you are.